Hello, everyone. My name is Abel Ndasho. I'm the Project Science Communications Coordinator at the ANH Academy. Welcome to today's webinar, co-hosted in collaboration with Actonet. Today's webinar focus will be on one of McManus funded projects on household water security scale, which is developing a tool to measure household level water insecurity. And we're delighted to have Sera Young, the PI from Northwestern University, leading the session. The Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy is a global research network in agriculture and food systems for improved nutrition and health, which serves as a platform for learning and sharing. We have members in over 90 countries, and if you have not signed up yet, then we encourage you to join our Academy Week. It's totally free, as well as convening technical working groups, hosting webinars and blogs. We also have the annual meeting of Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Community. And this year, the 4th ANH Academy Week takes place in Hyderabad, India, from 24th to 28th of June. So save the date. The Academy Week consists of two interlinked components. The first one is the Learning Lab, which is a 3 years of training sessions in interdisciplinary agriculture, nutrition, and health research. The second one is a research conference, which is an abstract-driven symposium featuring oral and poster presentations, keynote speakers, roundtable, and side events as well. Registration for the Academy Week opens next week on Monday, March 18. For more information, visit our website at www.anhacademy.org. Anna will soon tell you more about Actonet Community of Practice and about today's webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few technical issues so we all know how to participate in today's event. So you can see the presentation slide on the left of your screen. On the right, you have the control panel that will allow you to ask questions. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to Sera at any time during the presentation using the question chat box in the control panel. You may send your question at any time during the Q&A session. All participants are currently muted. If you want to ask a question using audio and you're sure that your microphone and speaker is working, you can raise your hands using the yellow hand on your control panel, and then we will unmute you. If at any point you experience any technical issues, please check your audio setting and your internet connection. If lost, please try to connect again using the same link. If not, don't worry, this webinar is recorded, so it will be available on our website. That's it for me for now. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Abel, for organizing. And to follow what Abel was saying about the ANH Academy Week, that's a great opportunity for people interested in the space to meet. As many of you know, if you've joined this webinar because of being a member of Actonet, we don't hold in-person meetings. We rather have online connection. And so it's a great opportunity to be able to meet in person. And we will be having later in the year, when it gets closer to the time before the ANH Academy Week, we will have more information about that, and also follow-ups for anyone who can't attend in person. So I do encourage you to check that out. Probably many of you have joined this webinar because of being members of Actonet, but if you're not a member, I'll send the link in the chat box so that you can sign up and be on the list to be aware of all of the updates that get passed around relevant to this space, linking agriculture and nutrition. So today in our webinar series, we are very, very happy to have Dr. Sera Young here to talk about a new metric, the household water security scale that she's been working on developing. Sera and I have worked together in the past, and we go way back to grad school where we started tromping around East Africa and working on a lot of issues related to what people consume and why. And for anyone who has done field work in low-income areas, and in particular, I know that Sera does a lot of work in Kenya and Tanzania, which is where when I was doing field work, I would sit around while the enumerators I was working with did surveys and notice how dry it was and how much I was relying on my bottle of filtered water throughout the day, and thinking about how I was working on food, but a critical limitation for these farming communities seemed to be on their access to water for crops and water, clean water for consumption in the household, without which people would be very vulnerable to diseases, which would have negative impacts on nutrition, despite any food access that they may have. So this topic around water security, I think, is long overdue and really welcome in terms of linking agriculture and nutrition. And without any further description, Sera, I'll turn it over to you. I'm going to disappear while she talks, and I'll come back for the Q&A session. Over to you, Sera.
Thanks, everyone. And just a plug for the ANH meeting. I've been to the first two of them. This will be the third. They're tremendous. So I hope to see many of you there in person. Today, yes, okay, good, advancing. I'm going to answer 3 questions in the course of this talk. It should be about 25 minutes long, because I would like to hear from you. So the questions I'll pose and answer are: what are the links between food and water insecurity? How to measure household water insecurity experiences globally? And then lastly, why would one measure household water insecurity globally using, for example, the HWISE scale that you'll learn about today? So the backstory is that I'm trained as an anthropologist, and as Anna mentioned, we were both at nutrition in Cornell together. And I think a lot about maternal and child health in those first 1,000 days. And I never would have guessed I would be doing any work on water. But I had this lovely NIH grant to study the impacts of food insecurity in the first 1,000 days. And we hypothesized that there would be 4 pathways by which food insecurity was deleterious. So we wanted to measure those. And it's easy to measure food insecurity. We were going to use the HFIAS in this particular study, which I think many of you are familiar with. You can have a score, a food insecurity score from 0, meaning not at all food insecure, to 27, the most extreme. And we had, if I may say, a beautiful study design where we saw women frequently and measured the heck out of food insecurity at all of these time points. That was my nutrition hat I was wearing. I was also wearing my anthropologist hat and making sure we were asking the right types of questions. So one of the formative work that we did was photo elicitation interviews, which is where you hand cameras to participants and ask them to take pictures of whatever it may be. And in this particular study, we asked what shapes how you feed your infant. And to my big surprise, we got pictures back like this. Lots of pictures of water. And people said, and it turns out that food and water are interconnected in many, many ways, some which were really surprising, some which are obvious. So this woman talked about collecting water that came from a prison. So the sewage was draining from the prison, and this was the water that they could have, and they could either use money to buy food to buy water, the bolded section here, or buying food, meaning that this was the water that they would have. Here's another example. This was a pregnant woman, she had recently delivered, and she basically hadn't brought enough water to the house. And so she's saying that, you know, my children are influenced, their nutrition is influenced, how I feed them is influenced because I said, you're the ones who didn't go to fetch water. I still have a backache and can't go fetch water. So I quickly scoured the literature to figure out surely there's an analog of the HWISE to measure experiences with water. And it turns out there are lots of measurements of water. We can measure hydrologic indicators like inflow, outflow. We can say how many cubic meters per capita are available at the level of the state. The water poverty index measures at the community level, so at the village or town or city. And there's lots of ways of looking at water quality, parts per billion of lead or arsenic, E. coli, colony forming units. And at the household, I found JMPs, the Joint Monitoring Programs, questions about drinking water. But they're very specific and they don't capture experiences of water insecurity in the same fulsome way that we know that the HWISE or the FIES does. So there was this big gap. And I clearly needed to be studying water insecurity along with food insecurity. So we crafted a scale from the bottom up, starting from scratch. And now we know how to measure household water insecurity in this particular area of Kenya amongst women of reproductive age. I mean, this is published and this is out there for anyone to use. I mean, the problem is that as an anthropologist, we think a lot about doing comparative studies and there's I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. And what we found having developed this scale is that there are all kinds of ways that water insecurity is impacting these 4 pathways. And you might want to just take a look at the nutrition pathway since we're focusing on it there. People talked about reduced dietary diversity, increased food insecurity, the energy expenditure of hauling water, having to not being able to wash their breasts, so they didn't want to breastfeed after just being in the fields, or leaving the baby while they went to fetch water. This obviously impacted child health too. So we know how to measure water insecurity now in Kenya, but we like to do comparative studies, and we know that there are problems with water all over the world. So based on satellite data, we know that at least 4 billion people experience water scarcity for at least 1 month per year, some many more. This is based on satellite data. And many more face problems with flooding and problems with water contamination. And it's for this reason, amongst others, that even the rich people in Davos are recognizing that water is one of the most pressing global risks. I mean, you can see water crisis here in red, but 4 of these 5 top global risks touch on water. So there are many links, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're measuring household water insecurity experiences globally. And just to step back for a second, it's important to remember how special water is. I mean, some people like to say like water is the new oil, but I would argue that it's not the new oil, because oil, there are substitutes, but there's no substitute for water. And the water on planet Earth is what makes us so special, at least the amounts in which it's present, makes us unique to anywhere else in the universe that we know about. We also, our life depends on it. 60 to 70% of our body is water. And of course, you think of water for drinking, that's the most obvious, but water touches almost every aspect of life, from food production to cooking and cleaning up those dishes after we've cooked, to cleaning up our grubby little babies after we've fed them, keeping our own bodies clean. And water is much more than its visceral needs. I mean, it's spiritual, it's transcendent, brings us together as communities. So my thesis here is that we need to be measuring experiences of water to really understand what's happening. And that's where, enter Stage Right. Thank you, Amana. Amana was the first person to fund this work on the globally equivalent scale of to measure water insecurity. So I'm making this presentation, but this is the work of many across a number of disciplines, including global health and development. We have clinicians on board, lots of anthropologists, of course, geographers, statisticians, nutritionists. I mean, we are still a nice multidisciplinary team who's playing well together. I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about how we developed this scale, But if you want more detail, there's this protocol that's publicly available, and the manuscript itself is under review right now. Hopefully, God willing, should be out soon. It's weird to do this as a webinar. I like to ask if anyone has developed a scale before. And if you have, you'll know that it's not for the faint of heart. So scale development is really hard work. And I didn't know that when I signed up to do this. At least I didn't realize the extent of it. But one of the things that came out of us developing a scale is this primer that I would highly recommend. So what it does is I think it takes the middle ground of being not too technical, though there are lots of technical references in it, but also not being, I've seen a lot of scales where people take 5 questions and call that a scale. This is somewhere in the middle that I think will help you ease into scale development. As it happens, there are 3 phases for scale development. The first is figuring out what you want to be asking about and what those questions should be. The second is the implementation and seeing how the scale shakes out, to use a not technical term. And then lastly, you want to evaluate the scale and make sure that it's measuring the things that you want to measure. So for item development, what we did was we reviewed all of the metrics of household water insecurity and came up with a definition that we all agreed on. And then identified items that would be appropriate. So we initially had 32 items that were relating to experiences of water insecurity at the household level that we thought would be globally applicable. I mean, there are a number of measures or scales for measuring household water insecurity that are really site-specific. Like you saw our Kenyan one. There's a great one for Ethiopia. There's a great one for Bolivia. But those don't work in different places. So we had these 32 items. And then we administered them, and we made sure that we did lots of translation, both linguistic translation and cultural translations, made sure that we were asking in the right way. Then we standardized enumerator training and sampling so that all of the sites did things more or less the same way. And administration happened in 28 sites. They were across 24 countries. We had something like 8,000 households that in the end we asked these items to. And we selected these items to really stress test the questions that we had. So we wanted really heterogeneous infrastructure, heterogeneous problems. We didn't want to just have questions that worked where water was scarce, but also where water was too much, where people had piped water, where people had tap stands. So a very diverse set. And in the end, after data collection was said and done, the distribution of responses would look like this. So gray would be affirmed, and in this particular figure, rarely, sometimes, often, or always are lumped together. It could be never experienced, or some of the items would be not applicable or not asked. So you can see, and I think this is really interesting to the crowd, we had crops and livestock. Did you ever not have enough water for crops? Did you ever not have enough water for livestock? Were really important because that's sort of my thinking. But of course, not everyone in the world is a farmer or has livestock. So in the end, this is what the data look like. I mean, I could look at this all day long. It's too much to look at, and nobody wants a 32 item scale when you could have less, and less is more. So we wanted to reduce the items, and we did that using a few principles. Thinking about, we used theory. We also used both rash modeling and classical test theory to cut items based on low affirmation. So for example, actually I won't give examples, you can ask me for examples later. If items weren't universal, if the items in the end were kind of tangential to the definition that we had, or if items were highly correlated. So if one item can do the work of 3, let's just have 1. And so we had a lot of meetings, some site PIs. So, we had a really nice and international crew. We had, Skype calls. I'm sure you've all had these Skype calls across 5 time zones. I was actually taking this call from the emergency room because my little daughter there needed to be there. So, and whatever. The point is that we did a lot of thinking, a lot of discussing. I want everyone to know we bled and sweated and had tears over all of this, but we gladly present to you, drumroll please, 12 items. They're phrased in a familiar way. How often have you or anyone in your household in the last, I can't quite see on my slide, but the last 4 weeks, last month, worried you wouldn't have enough water for all of your household needs? Has your main water source been interrupted or limited? And that could be water pressure, that could be the water's cut 23 hours of the day, the river could be dried up, any kind of interruption. Has there not been enough water to wash clothes? And I'll let you read the other 9. So it's a total of 12. Now, were these the right items is the big question. And we collected a lot of other data besides just experiences of water insecurity. So we had sociodemographics, food insecurity, perceived stress, to see if the scale is valid. And the short answer is that it is. Higher water insecurity scores are associated with greater stress, with greater food insecurity, and greater time to collect water. So a bunch of types of validity we explored and they panned out. And this is really important for a cross-culturally equivalent scale. I mean, you want a 7 in each of these sites to mean a 7. And I'm also happy to report that the meaning of the 7 holds up. So yay, the scale is now ready for broad implementation. We have this beautiful manual, if I do say so myself, that's just finalized. It's ready. And the timing is good. So the UN High-Level Panel on Water declared this to be the 2018, the Water Action Decade. They talk about how you can't manage what you can't measure and that we need higher resolution data. So that was good timing. So what are we going to know when we implement the HWISE scale? So the scale will tell us about prevalence, and it will also tell us about it will help us to identify vulnerable populations. The theme of World Water Week this year is leaving no one behind, and without high resolution data, it's hard to know which populations are in fact left behind. So I've posted on the DHS website, they're accepting comments on what the contents are. You can comment on it. I would appreciate if you commented on the value or not of including HWISE either in the core questions, which is a stretch. I mean, space is really at a premium there, or using it as an additional module. So that's one way to look at kind of large representative samples to assess prevalence. The other is through the Gallup World Polls. So I gave a presentation in September of last year, and someone from UNESCO was in attendance, was really excited and reached out to Gallup and said, like, we need to get this, we need these representative data. And I'm so pleased that the conversations have gone really well since then. So we have UNESCO and Gallup World Polls and the HWISE Consortium are working hard to make this get into Gallup World Polls. They even sent their ambassador to our launch in DC in February. And the vision is that these would become the global data on household water insecurity. I don't need to tell this crew what the Sustainable Development Goals are, but what might be new to you is that the World Poll, like inclusion of data in the World Polls, is a clear pathway to becoming an SDG indicator. So I'm sure you're familiar with the FIES. So that was collected by the Food Insecurity Experiences scale. That's a pathway. Gallup collected it. It became an indicator. Same for financial inclusion. Same for modern slavery. I hope you know who this is. This is Cardi B. And I'm with her in many senses, but one of the things that she has a song Money is that it's not cheap to get data collected by Gallup. And so we're in the process of fundraising so that it can get in the 2020 round. So that eventually, this should be familiar to you, that this becomes the metric of household water insecurity. We'll also be able to determine the consequences of household water insecurity. So you saw from Kenya, there was a lot that people perceived, and those are qualitative data. These are important pathways that I think you could see the plausibility of water impacting all of them. But the science is wide open. We just don't know because we haven't quantified it. So there's these different food insecurity ways of assessing food insecurity. And then we have what I like to think of as the sister scale, the household water insecurity metric. So I only have one, a ridiculous animation in this presentation. This is it. So this field is on fire. I mean, there's 15,900 references if you search Google household food insecurity. And if you do the same for household water insecurity, there's like a measly 180 references, and half of them are from the people in the HWISE consortium. So this is a really exciting opportunity to quantify how water insecurity impacts food insecurity, how water insecurity affects depression, stress, and to do so in a really powerful way. So the last type of information that HWISE will tell us is if our interventions are working, how to monitor and evaluate water-related activities. And to this end, I'm pleased to report that a number of NGOs are taking up the measurement and are using it to assess all of the things that they are doing as interventions, or also to just get a baseline. So my thinking here is that measuring water insecurity will really help us to understand not just water insecurity for water insecurity's sake, because that's not, I don't think that that's actually that interesting. But I think understanding how water shapes what we grow or what we consume, or how we take care of our families, or how we relate as societies, that's the exciting part. And so with that, I want to thank the many people who made this work possible, my own research group, but also the HWISE Executive Committee, who've worked hard to keep everyone doing good science, the analytic team, who those Skype calls, the so many outputs were tremendous. Also the funders, especially Amana. And with that, I can take your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sera. It's really exciting to see this development, and you make a really strong case for why this is an important variable for us to have globally across countries, to understand all of the relationships between water insecurity and other important pieces of well-being. Right now, we can allow everyone who is tuned in to raise your hand. You can click on the little hand icon above the next to the attendee names if you'd like to speak. And meanwhile, I don't think everyone can see the questions that have been raised in this platform, but Cecilia Gonzalez had a couple of questions already that maybe we can start with. So she asks, how long did the entire process take, and how much was the investment on the process and scale, referring to the process of developing the scale? And then also, how accessible is the scale to practitioners in terms of ease of use, training? For example, can it be used in a program by practitioners, or is it primarily a tool for researchers?
Those are great.
And then there's one more that came in also from Cecilia about water being important not only for health and nutrition, but also for planetary health and natural resources. So another great question. Thanks, Cecilia, for all of that. Over to you, Sera.
So I had a timeline slide in here that I cut. And my first answer is it's all a blur, but the second answer is this went quickly. I think 2016 is when we got the grant. And so we had proposed collecting data in 6 different sites, and that would be our cross-culturally valid proof. But some research is really hard and it's like pulling teeth. I have lots of research like that. And some snowballs really nicely, and people heard about this and we said like, oh, we'll be a site, or like we'll be a site, or we can do this. And so we played together nicely, and lots of people worked hard to collect this and quickly. So I mean, there are still some sites who are collecting data. So for example, this was collected thanks to Sabrina Rashid in the DHS sites in Bangladesh. So we'll be able to see how HWISE and DHS variables, I keep saying play together. I mean, we'll be able to really explore those relationships. So the short answer is 2016, we started data collection. 2018, we submitted the manuscript to, I'll just say it, Lancet Global Health, and they rejected it. Can you believe it? So now it's under review at another journal, and we expect, hopefully, it's accepted in the next month or so. So that was the timeline. The costs, it's public knowledge that the amount of grant is 300,000 pounds. Anna, Abel? So something like 300,000 pounds. And then we kind of made stone soup with that. So people would say like, I can give you just a few $1,000s to include it in your like large clinical trial. How about that? Or, you know, lean on grad school friends to say like, I'll give you $0 for including it in your study. But in the end, won't it be great that you'll know how water insecurity works? We also have a strong belief in consortium authorship, and this is the work of many. I want to say that again, it's the work of many. And so this is a great opportunity to be involved in our Household Water Insecurity Consortium, where we have different meetings and different professional developments. So not a lot of money, maybe $400,000 all told, but lots of goodwill on top of that. And it's, for scale development, you need less money than nationally representative types of data, because it doesn't need to be as large of sample sizes. I mean, the sample sizes at each site was something like 300 households. There was some variation, but right around 300. Ease of use, that's your third question. I'll let you be the judge of that. The questions are phrased very simply. The scoring is very straightforward. So each item is scored as never, rarely, sometimes, or often, or always. So those are the answers: never, rarely, sometimes, often, or always. And often and always are 3s, sometimes 2, rarely 1, never 0. So 0 to 36. 12 times 3 is 36. And we thought about doing a more complex, I mean, I think about the FIES, and they have a much fancier and sophisticated way of assessing food insecurity, and maybe we will move to that eventually. But for now, this has worked really well to have the simple scoring. So the manual itself is 12 pages. I'm happy to share it with you. And I would like to think it's very field friendly. There was a comment about the importance of water for planetary health, and I don't know if I missed the question, but I would say yes, it is important. We think about it from our anthropocentric for human health, but certainly we need to be understanding the health of water systems as well.
Great. Meanwhile, we had another question come in from Kathy Kurz. She says, I'm interested in knowing if you tested this with mobile households such as pastoralists.
Yeah, so no. And currently it's 2 different anthropologist friends are going to be doing this, one amongst the Hadza, and there's some discussion of doing it in northern Kenya as well, among the pastoralists there.
Can you say more about that? Like, what would you expect from populations that may be mobile for the purpose of seeking water?
Mm-hmm. I hope that this works the same way. I mean, that's the first part. It was really good to have these. So we had like version 1.0 of the questions, and then version 2.0, where I mean, I saw my own biases in how I was phrasing it. I'm thinking about people who are fetching water, and I'm thinking about water scarcity. But by working in places like Onda, Colombia, where flooding is the problem, it pulled us back from my ethnocentrism to be thinking more globally. I mean, all of these items, when I think about the phrasing, I don't see any that would be flagged. There was one question actually that didn't make it in. Said, how often have you thought about moving houses because of problems with water? So good that that's not in. And off the top of my head, I can't think of others, but whoever asked the question, do you see any that jump out as problematic for mobile populations?
I'm sorry, excuse me, I misspoke. That was Kelly Kurz, not Kathy. Kelly, if you'd like to be unmuted, just go ahead and raise your hand, and you can feel free to speak more about that. In the meantime, on that topic, feel free, Kelly, if you do want to speak later, to just raise your hand, or anyone else who'd like to talk about pastoralists or another question. On the topic, Sera, that you just mentioned about items that didn't make it in or were controversial, I would ask the question I asked you once before, but we didn't have a chance to discuss very much, which was about the question, does lack of water make you feel angry, or something like that? It was the word angry, and I wondered if that might present some issues or problems translating across cultures based on kind of cultural appropriateness of demonstrating feelings of anger or dissatisfaction.
Yeah, so there's a lot, like I said, there's the linguistic translation, and then there's like culturally appropriate ways of asking. And I'm thinking in particular in Brazil that some of the participants, this wasn't my site, this was Wendy Jepson's, were so, what was they were so upset about the food insecurity questions that it was a good example of how sensitive some of these items can be, because I mean, what can be more tragic than not having the resources to care for your family? So it was very upsetting. And so in the prompts, or the probe, so like in the manual, we have the 12 questions, and then we have prompts and probes, or alternate phrasing. And we talk a lot about different ways of using, I mean, anger is a very forceful term. And there are different, upset, and a number of other synonyms exactly for that reason. You know, and Ed Frangello, so we also have a question about stigma. How often have you felt stigmatized because of problems with water? And he said, this is now oral history at this point, that was a question that was considered for the food insecurity skills, but that it's like so upsetting to ask about stigma being experienced that in the end the group thought that it shouldn't be included. I mean, we did a lot of cognitive testing around this, and people were ultimately okay with asking that question about water. So, yeah. I can't hear you, Anna. Oh.
Thank you. So we have a couple of hands up. Daniel McMahon asks a straightforward question: when will the HWISE report be available to the public? And then we'll go to the hands. Yeah, so it's out. I mean, people are using it with the caveat that it is not, the paper isn't accepted yet. Either way, it's a thing. I mean, like, we've done more validation than I know of any other scale. So we feel confident in this, and yeah, you can have it. But I don't know if you want to add anything. Yeah, I think that's good. Thank you. 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 Thank
and the manual itself is done as well. I did want to say what on to some of these questions that got cut from, I mean, what we're doing is like a necessarily reductionist endeavor, is to find these items that work everywhere. It doesn't mean that the items that were cut are necessarily bad items. Some are bad items. Like I had insisted that we keep a question of, have you ever not had enough water? How often have you not had enough water to take your medicine? I was doing a lot of work with HIV infected populations. That's a stupid question. Nobody should use that question. It's just not widely useful. But the questions about livestock, the questions about farming, the questions about caring for children, I mean, all evaluation is dependent on what the purpose is. So if you are caring about food production, you should include those items as well. Please, I beg of you, keep those 12. Like, don't drop any of those 12, so that way our data will all be comparable. But feel free to add other specific items.
Okay, so Emily Rupert has her hand up. I'll unmute you, Emily. And okay, you can go ahead and speak.
Well, Sarah, very well done. It's nice to see you, even though you can't see me.
Hi.
Hi. So I just loved listening to this, and I'm just so proud of you. And after I come down from my awe, I'm interested as we think more about agriculture and nutrition, and perhaps just because I focus on the nutrition side of things, is there something like this that agriculture sector folks use for agriculture water security? I was looking at the scale in one of your handouts, or some of the items, and there's watering gardens and watering crops. Do people in agriculture, and maybe other people on the call could respond, have some way, and maybe some of the other measures you mentioned, like at the community level, does that come up as ways people assess water security? But is there a household agriculture water security something out there?
So I can say that I haven't seen any other, I mean, I've seen site-specific measures of household water insecurity broadly, nothing specific for agriculture. And Emily, if I know you, I think you're talking about small-scale, smallholder farmers. You're not talking about like in large industrial farming, right?
Most likely. I'm just thinking of anybody who uses water for agriculture. Is there a way that they assess water security? Presumably a larger farmer has the resources to secure water.
I haven't seen any, but I'd be very curious for what the crowd knows.
Yeah. I'm doing some work with Penn State in Western Honduras where there's a lot of water scarcity, and that's affecting, the home gardening decisions and, what are we promoting, for improved household nutrition through horticulture. So I think it's possible that there could be like a cousin scale if this doesn't perfectly apply to agriculture, that there could be a cousin scale adapted from this one, or selected indicators that you may have had from the original 32.
Yeah.
To create something like that with our friends in agriculture.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I mean, I think a good starting point would be to just start with those 12 items, ask the additional 2 that are related, livestock and crops. And you might want to distinguish crops from gardens, since gardens are more likely to be irrigated, like hand irrigated. And then ask like an open-ended question more, like what else do you think about with water and agriculture? And then anyone could see what themes emerge and develop some other questions with that.
Right. I'm thinking disaster risk reduction type projects. I know USAID has a whole stream of work in that area, and a lot of development agencies do. So that might be a place where people are looking at vulnerability and resilience with climate change. Anyway.
That's a new area for me. We are thinking a lot about coping strategies with water, though, and they can go in a few ways. So one, we've combed like the ethnographic literature it's a systematic lit review, so not just ethnographic literature, different ways that people respond to water problems. So moving is an extreme example. There's a whole range, and it makes me think about the food security coping strategies scale as well. where, how often have you been begging, and how often have you sent your children to other people's houses for eating? Not that I'm eager to do any more skill development for, like, I don't know, the next year, but I can see that would be a really the behaviors, not just the experience of water or not, but the behaviors for making oneself resilient to these different types of shocks would be a useful area of study.
Sure. Well, maybe you can punt it to a colleague and be our advisor.
Gladly.
All right, I'm going to mute myself and give somebody else a chance to talk to you.
Emily?
Could you say more about the types of kind of large-scale data there are on water? You showed a world map, and I'm interested in if you were able to implement globally through the Gallup World Poll and or DHS. That would open up a lot of interesting research regarding comparisons between kind of satellite data or whatever data there usually is on water availability, and then household water security for home consumption. And then in addition, sort of what Emily was talking about as maybe the middle ground of water as it's available for crop production. So could you say more about the types of kind of macro data there are available on water?
Yeah. And anyone should feel free to jump in and correct me on this. Like I said, I'm a new water guy, but what you saw, that map was based on surface water that's available, and that's those data are really kind of easily available. I mean, NASA makes a lot of that public, like for public consumption. I mean, it's not easy to do, but in fact, an applied mathematician here at Northwestern and I put in a grant just internally to see how satellite available water would compare to these HWISE scores from these particular sites where we did it. And unfortunately, we weren't funded, and at the time I was like, this is baloney. But I would also say that there's a lot of reasons to think that, like, we shouldn't use satellite data to validate this scale, because water is highly political. Even within a household, it's political. One of the slides that I cut was a woman talking about how domestic violence. So, I mean, to put it bluntly, she said basically, I'm afraid to not have water in the household because my husband will beat me if I don't have it. And there's a lot of discussions of arguing, which is code for physical and other types of violence in the absence of water. So even if there's water in the household, not everyone is getting it. But even if there's water even quite close by, I mean, I can almost see Lake Michigan from my office, but that doesn't mean that people in this environment aren't water insecure, because in the Midwest, hundreds of thousands of families have their water shut off for non-payment. So the point is that, like, just because it's available doesn't mean it's accessible. And that is an old story from the food security literature. Is that what you were thinking, Anna, or was it something else?
Yeah, great. No, that makes a lot of sense. Just in terms of what your thoughts are about those sort of, the usefulness of using other kinds of data.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought was like, God, it would be great to just be able to rely on satellite data, because it's a lot of work to go and talk to people and do the surveys and send them. And it's expensive. And if we have better, cheaper ways, like, let's do it. But I haven't been able to think of an alternative.
Yeah. There were a couple more comments that came in from Cecilia. Would you like to, your hand isn't raised, but I'll unmute you. Just, okay, good. If you, in case you want to say those comments out loud, because not everybody can see them. So, trying to work with the system here. Okay, go ahead, Cecilia.
Hello, thank you so much. So I had a follow-up question, but I think you did answer that earlier, which is, if it is possible, if you think in a scale like this, it would be possible to have optional questions for populations like the pastoralist populations. And you mentioned that earlier, but that was my question. And also my comment is I feel that water use in agriculture is a really big part of water. And we, in a project that we were supporting in home gardens in Guatemala, that was also a big part of people's decisions to actually the ability to have or not have a home garden, because the community controlled the potable water, and if they were to have a home garden, they would be using that. And so I think Emily's comment and question about that is very important, because the rural households will have to answer these questions of water use for agriculture.
Yeah, and understanding how much time it takes. So let's say that water is available. Is it easily accessible or not, or is it really precarious? Are you carrying it over crazy rocky hills? Are you spending 3 hours to get it, or is it actually really right there? In The Economist this week, it's a report on water in the world, and they're referring more to, so they talk about water in agriculture, and that something like 70% of all accessible water is used for agriculture. I don't know, I'm sure that it's smallholder farmers are a very small portion of that, but water in ag is a huge deal.
Great. I think we answered the questions that came in on the question box. So great, with good time here. Anybody else who has any final comments can raise your hand. I'm not seeing any hands being raised right now.
If I can turn a question to the group, which is like, I'm biased. I've been thinking about this and doing this, and obviously think it's the best thing since sliced bread, but I would really welcome skeptical questions, or like, clearly we forgot this one thing, or this wouldn't work in my area of the world or my research because X, Y, or Z.
Sarah, this is Emily again. Cecilia's comment made me think about the work I did in Afghanistan about communal control of water. And now that I'm working on home gardens as well, I'm realizing that as I'm putting a paper together about home gardens, it may be that people are very my question is, how common is it to have community control of water, especially in water scarce areas? That's my assumption, is it's more common to have like a water steward. And if every household gets equal access, or access based on household numbers, I mean, that's an interesting piece of anthropology that wouldn't be scale development that you could work on. You know, does that influence household size that people aspire to, having more children so they get more water or less? Does it affect if they choose to do a home garden or not? If they only get a certain amount, and we're trying to promote food security and women's control of food security and that sort of thing. And home gardens can help with that, but yet there's all this, you know, do you have a fixed amount of water available to make decisions about?
So that's a really interesting point, because what we did is we collected information on the source of water. So what type of water? Are you getting it from a river? Are you getting it, is it piped into your house? Is it a borehole within, and then how the distance? But we don't know who controls those various sources. And I'm also thinking, I'll come back to that. I'm also thinking of an anecdote from Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, which is a Tina Fey movie, pop culture, sorry, where she's a journalist in Afghanistan, and basically this well keeps getting blown up, and the U.S. government tries to figure out who's blowing up the well, and as it turns out, women in the village themselves were blowing up the well because they really valued the opportunity to go away from men, sorry men on the call, go away from men and have some time of like gossiping and relaxing while they did this task. So I think about that example a lot. I mean, I'm not only driven by Hollywood in my research, I assure you, but thinking about, I mean, this experience of preferences is really important in these experiences. So if people aren't, if they're happy going to get water, then we shouldn't like impose this sort of like, you have this very Western, you should have water piped into your house, ideal in some ways. It's just to your Afghanistan point, Emily, I had to say that. But who controls water is a really good question. And, you know, Mark Twain says, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. It's a very, very hot topic that, I mean, escalates nations. So thinking about it, like who controls the water you have is something that I have made a note to start asking in subsequent sites. So thank you.
You're welcome. So in Afghanistan, there is like a water person in every village. There's like the head of the village, and then there's the water person who determines how much you get. And the villages where I work, they would have like 1 or 2 days a month of water access. So.
And was it per capita, like, you know, 50 liters per household member or something?
I think I can ask someone and find out, but I think it was a fixed, well, actually, the one that's coming to mind is they would fill up like a concrete
cistern
structure. Yeah, it's like, it was like a pool in front of the mosque, and they'd fill it up once a month or every 15 days, and then people could draw from it. But it was frowned upon to use it for anything like growing too much within your home compound. And so when I was hoping to see a lot of vegetables and things grown, they said, well, we used to have water for that, but now we have such restricted water, you know, we only grow a few flowers, you know, but we can't really water our almond trees or our, you know, peach trees and things like that. And our grapevines are withering because we can't use the extra water for that because it's frowned upon, because everybody who visits you would notice that. So it was really interesting. And the water got progressively green as you got to the end of the 15 days.
Yeah.
And that was still what they had to use. And so it's kind of gross.
Yeah.
And
no, I remember when I was doing fieldwork in Zanzibar, when water was cut all the time on Pemba. And so we would have these big buckets of water in the like Uwani, and by the end of the week, it would be like laden with mosquitoes, or like crawling with mosquito larvae. So even when you do have water, is like you need to think about quantity and quality.
Mm-hmm. The water where we were would come in through these little ditches, and it wasn't covered, and animals would be grazing along the ditches as well. If they would travel the water would travel a couple kilometers to get to the villages.
So one last question before we close. Sera, if this scale were implemented globally or even locally, what sorts of decisions do you think that would be informed at kind of policy level by having this information? Yeah.
So one of the things that I think that this would do is to bring water insecurity to the forefront. I mean, it's an old adage that like, if you don't measure it, it doesn't count, or that which is counted counts, or I gotta get that down. But it's easy to say, like, in the United States, we don't have problems with water. Like, look, there's the lake. But there are all kinds of problems with people worried about, and rightly so, not worried, like empirically, their water is contaminated with all kinds of stuff. And empirically, there's no running water in households. So the first thing should be is to bring it to the forefront as a problem. The second is to show the heterogeneity of the problem. So I talk too much about food insecurity, but it's such a good analogy, and I think this crowd is amenable to it. We used to measure food insecurity based on calorie balance sheets, where we would say like this much food has been produced divided by this many individuals. These countries are food secure. And when the food insecurity scale started becoming experiential in the 80s and then onward, we started to see how much variation there was within a place like thought of as food secure, like the United States once was, that there are these huge pockets of places where people are really food insecure. And then the third thing I would say is that we'll be able to quantify like the attributable risk of water insecurity to a range of hard health outcomes, including, and I think probably this will be the biggest, I mean, it's the biggest surprise to me, but I think it also is the most impactful, is the stress on people's mental health. Women, I mean, it's mostly women who are responsible for water acquisition and then for the apportioning within the household allocation. That they dream about it, they worry about it, they are organizing their day around it, they're not bathing themselves because of it. There's so many ways that it's this mental burden to make sure that there's enough water, that I think we'll be able to like attribute risk of disease to this problem. And I wouldn't be able to do this, but I know I have friends who could, is to talk about the economic costs of water insecurity as well. So I think there's a lot for us to be able to quantify once we have not just the quantification of water insecurity, but all of those outcomes, those 4 pathways that I showed you. Whew, so much to do.
Great. Well, I think we'll end there. And you know, you have so much to do. Better get started right away because we want to see this. We want to see this scaled up and used for all the reasons that you talked about. It's so exciting. And I think some of the best inventions are those things which are so obvious that you're like, how has this not been done yet? I think this is...
Like, surely somebody has done this. Like, just save me this work. Come on, show me.
Right.
It turns out it hadn't been. I mean, please raise your hand if you've got another one of these things. Okay, everybody.
It seems like a lot of common sense and really useful. So thank you very much for bringing this to Ag to Newt and ANH Academy. And we will be posting this recording and the basic minutes of the call following the call whenever they are ready. And I'm sure Sera has her contact information there. You can reach out with any specific questions and look at the resources that are also posted on the event webpage. So we will be in touch with that. But for now, thanks everyone for joining the call, and big thanks to Sera for taking the time to present and share this with us, and to Abel and the ANH Academy for hosting the webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.